Welcome back, Raw Thoughts listeners, to another episode with me, Mackenzie Tiggs. Today, I have Patrick McCurdy on with us, really deep diving into the family aspect of first responders, his career, and what he's doing now. So, thank you, Patrick, for coming on.
It is such an honor. I really like what you're doing. I tried. You've done a lot, so I can't catch up with everything, but um, I've become a big fan since I first learned about you when we connected a little while ago.
I'm curious with you saying that, what is it that's different than other people that I give from your point of view?
I think some people come in with a script, and I don't have a problem with that, especially when a person's telling their story. It can be really hard, and not everybody is comfortable in front of a camera or microphone or sitting on a couch across from somebody. So I don't have a problem with that. But I think that yours is different because it's a conversation, and you go where it takes you, and you're okay with that, and you follow that. And I like the fact that you push people a little bit, and yourself included, to go deeper, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate you giving that feedback because I do hear that so often with people where they're like, "Oh, keep doing what you're doing. We love it." And I'm like, "Yeah, but what parts of it that do you love?" And people for listening to this, like I would absolutely love your feedback. And the reason being is because I want to keep providing things that you guys like. And if there's any changes that I make, that may be that I'm taking things away. And so, just with your feedback, I appreciate that.
Definitely. Like I said, I really like it. And I think a lot of the topics I didn't mention, the topics that you cover are important. And
Yeah,
I don't even know if I spoke English in that last sentence. The
you're good.
topics that you cover are important. And even if you don't get feedback on it, I know that people are benefiting from those,
Yeah.
or will in the future as they come across.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's deep dive into who you are. What is your background in being a first responder? How you've grown up, and like I said, where you are today.
Certainly, like with everybody, my background, my story, so to speak, we always act like there's only one, right? My story starts long before I came into the picture. My mom grew up in Germany, and she grew up during a particularly difficult time when Hitler was rising up. And her mom was a nurse, and her dad was basically a farmer. And so as Hitler came into power, they knew how bad and difficult and dangerous that was, and did what in a small community a nurse and a farmer could do to resist it. And there are a lot of stories about that. But then they lived it through and endured that really difficult time during the war. And afterwards, we're in East Germany where the Russians came in and took over. So my mom grew up under communism. And we were just talking last night. I mean, that to me has resonated throughout my life because people in life resort back to their earliest trauma over and over again. And some of us are fortunate where we didn't have that earliest trauma until later in life. But for those who have been impacted in childhood and sometimes even in the womb, because we know that babies can hear things and process things even in the womb, um, we keep resonating or reflecting back upon that. And that affects the way that we're capable of interacting with stress. It affects the fear that we live with. It affects our relationships. It affects everything, our decision making. And that has been an evident and relevant theme in my mom's life throughout my whole life. Um, my dad grew up, as he always says, corn-fed Iowa farm boy, but he didn't grow up on a farm. um, when he was 7, his dad died, and living in a small community with a single mom, which wasn't even a term back then when my dad was growing up, really impacted him and who he was. And then later in life, if we fast forward, my mom and my dad both became police officers. And my uncle was a highway patrolman during the tumultuous 60s. And my dad was a Oakland cop during the 60s. My mom, Alameda County Sheriff's Department during the 60s, and my uncle in the same area in the highway patrol. And so that tumultuous, dangerous time really formed who my dad later became and how that influenced me when he was my dad. Um, so I grew up, and from the time I was a little guy, I have the pictures, and the only thing I ever wanted to do was be a police officer.
Mindbase is the official sponsor of Raw Thoughts podcast. Mindbase is the only mental health and wellness technology platform that goes far beyond their traditional wellness app for first responders specifically. It uses data to optimize a proactive and people-driven approach to first responders' wellness. Please reach out today to see about getting Mindbase into your agency to help our first responders.
And I have a picture the first time I saw my dad in uniform. I was still a baby, and he was a detective at first, but he came home for Christmas Eve and was holding me, and you could see my face and everything. That was, my mom says that was the moment, and I joke that that moment where I decided what I wanted to do came way before that.
Yeah.
And every time I had a chance to buy a little Hot Wheel car, it was a police car. Every time, I was given one of those plastic fire hats at the fair. And I always wore it backwards because a police hat has to have a brim on it, and it didn't. And I didn't know why you'd wear that goofy looking thing.
That's too
and I'll
funny.
get my jabs in on you firefighters and EMTs every chance.
Yes, I can tell.
Yeah, it's all fair game. You can come back at me. I know you've got some.
Yes.
But
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you're good. You keep going.
Oh, I just that was it. And so the first uniform I got to wear was a Cub Scout, and that to me was, of course, my mom and dad were involved in that, and they were leaders in the group. But then when I was old enough to become a Boy Scout, well, that was okay. That was cool, but that wasn't the real deal, because then I became an explorer, which is a geek wannabe. But there, I think, is a good, fair starting point. I guess I should say that I grew up in a pretty rough area, and it was a suburb of Oakland called Hayward, and not, oh man, it's gone downhill now, but not the best area, but it was for what police officers made at that time, because my mom stopped to raise us, and what we were living with. I mean, my parents did really well providing for us and protecting us from some of that stuff. But the gang influence and pull was a very real thing. And I had a lot of friends who got drawn into that lifestyle, and a lot of friends who died in different ways while I was growing up. And it sounds kind of funny to see me here now, many years later, talking about that. But it was a very real thing, because in my eyes, my dad was the toughest, badass hero in the world. And I wanted to be like him. And what I realize now is the reason my dad was truly my hero was he was the most kind and loving person I knew, one of them. My mom was another one. But what I saw was the tough guy. And those were the stories I heard when I, tagged along with him to the police station or to a police event or parade, was all these guys that say, yeah, your dad, he tackled this guy, or you should have seen him throw him through the, across the room and handcuff him. And that was what I looked at and wanted to be like. So I think at this time when I was finally coming up and, like I said, wearing a uniform, my whole quest was to be a badass. But that's what gang life, the allure of it, that's what it
Right.
offers too, is, to be a tough guy, a badass, so to speak. So luckily I didn't get caught up in that. And the first year that I became a police explorer, one of the explorers committed suicide. And, as adults, when we look back at I think he was 16, 17-year-old who has a girlfriend problem and commits suicide, it's such a horrible, tragic decision, because you end everything for something that you will recover from at some point. And he was given police honors, and not a full-scale police funeral, but the people who knew him, and he was very much loved and appreciated in the department. He did a lot of things, and he was, a great student and athlete and everything, kind of a up-and-coming future community hero. And one other kid also in the group, who was a good friend of mine, thought that was the coolest thing. And within a year, he committed suicide as well, for the same reason. So at that same time, while that was happening there, I had other friends that I grew up with who committed suicide. And we talk like it's a new thing, or like this explosion in suicides is unusual. And it is, but I mean, it's always been a thing. And then I lost friends to that lifestyle I talked about, the violence or the drugs. And while I was 15, so still within that first year, I experienced my first line of duty death. And that was a guy who worked for my dad. And I knew him Lots of explorers rode along with him. He was a really aggressive, good officer, and he was murdered at a domestic violence call 2 blocks from my house. I grew up on Broadmoor Avenue, and 1 block from the police department. He was stabbed and killed. So that didn't, but probably should have rocked my paradigm. That made me drive in harder and push down harder to do what I wanted to do. I mean, at that point, I knew this is what I wanted to do. And I remember going to his funeral after being, at several funerals. I also around that same time, about a year later, had a good friend who was a Marine helicopter pilot. And while training to deploy for Desert Storm overseas, he crashed the chopper, and he and his crew were killed in the San Francisco Bay practicing mine sweeps. So all of these great men of honor and the heroic modeling that they represented for me and mentoring just made me drive in harder. But, I went to these funerals, and I remember saying to my dad, man, Dad, I was crying in uniform. It was embarrassing. My dad said the right thing and coached me the way a good dad should, but that's not what I heard, because I went in with confirmation bias, a preconceived notion, and I thought my dad was going to say, yeah, the way you don't cry is you bite your lip or, bite your cheek or something like that, and teach me to be a tough guy. And so he didn't say what I thought he's going to say, but I translated it the way I wanted to because of my confirmation bias. And I think we're all guilty of that sometimes. So he said, Pat, a real man will cry. And when you lose a loved one, you want to pay your respects to them, and it's okay to cry. It's a good thing. It's healthy, and that's what you should be doing when you lose somebody. And that wasn't the answer I wanted, because I'm a badass, right? Mm-hmm. So what I heard was you have to work harder and learn not to cry. And so it became my goal to do that. And I made, at that young age, a decision. It's my obligation to go to every single killed in the line of duty funeral or line of duty death funeral. And you can imagine how that goes for you, because when you start going to those, you see, even if you don't know the person, you see this video with touching music, and you see them kissing their kids and playing around. And the first time they put on a uniform when they're goofy and have that big hair and big mustache or whatever. And by the time you leave, you feel like you know them. I thought doing that and exposing myself to repeated trauma would be like developing a callus when I do repeated work with my hands, like lifting weights or shoveling or something, because eventually it's a blister that hurts and then it becomes a callus. But that doesn't happen with your heart, so to speak, and your soul, and it doesn't happen with your brain. So that led me to where I'm at. And eventually I did become a jailer in the jail, which means that at 18, I started. So I started really early. And that means more trauma. I did CPR on several people. All of them died. So you don't want me to do CPR.
Hey, I'm gonna actually tell you that the ratios, and I don't know the exact numbers, but it's more times than not that you do CPR on somebody and you don't get them back. So it has nothing to do with the effects of CPR. It has everything to do with actually how kind of ineffective it can be.
I do
I know
understand
that's a
that. I've
bummer to
heard that.
say.
No, I do understand that. And especially like the first time the guy swallowed a condom full of dope, packed with dope, and it exploded. And when a person it's predetermined they're going to die, and their internal organs are literally sometimes exploding with all the pressure and everything. There's nothing you could do. But, in that moment, you're a rescuer, a savior. And, it's still a fail. Mm-hmm. And it's still the experience. I remember kneeling down in all that nasty fluid and vomit and everything doing CPR. And I remember as he's writhing around and having spasms and yelling out, I remember saying out loud, dear God, nobody deserves to die this way, Mm-hmm. And then 3 or 4, I think it was a total of 4 times in that 3 or 4 year period, I did CPR and lost them. During that time, my good friend who was hired the same day as me, and he was a patrol officer, a police officer. I was a correctional officer. He was murdered in Oakland trying to break up a fight. And he was killed with multiple guns and his own that was taken from him. Um, and then from there, it doesn't get better, because once you experience loss, grief, trauma, you never lose that. You can overcome the trigger or activation or flashback or whatever it is that you experience, but you never lose that experience. You just continue collecting more of these heavy,
Right.
weighty things. And so we carry this heavy load all the time. And then the best thing in the world happened. I became a member of the King County Sheriff's Office in Seattle, Washington, and I moved away from home completely by myself and went down that adventure and just kept collecting those heavy experiences. So there's the super short version of a long lifetime of adventure.
Yeah. I want to ask you, I mean, there's a couple of things that pop into my head of what you've discussed. One of that being, you know, what age were you when those two friends committed suicide? You were 15, 16, did you say?
No, I think I was 14,
14.
because that was the earliest age you could be a police explorer where I grew up. And so in that year from 14 to 15 is when all those things happened in the beginning.
So when that occurred, what did people do? I mean, this isn't suicide is not something that is just like new. And like you said, it's, I would say getting more light shined on it. But what was it like back then for that to happen? And what did people say, or how did people have conversations about it? Or did they just not? And we've just gone decades and decades of nobody talking about this.
No, I was really lucky. And I think this formed my entire perspective that I carry today, because the people who led our group got together with parents. And one of those parents was my dad, who started the group when I was a kid. So I got to go to meetings and stuff when I was a kid. And he was leading the group. They recognized that they had a problem when that second kid committed suicide. And we legitimately believe it was because of the first one, because that police type funeral was so cool and it made it look honorable. Um, so they buckled down, and I had to go to, I think it was an 80-hour course, which was after hours after high school. We had to go multiple times on suicide awareness and prevention. And it's the same stuff today. I mean, the science is the same, the body is the same, the brain is the same. They did some things that perhaps weren't as productive, because we would meet together, and like anniversary dates become really important for people as they deal with trauma. So we met and we would leave a seat open for them. And they heard about that and they shut that down, which I think as a parent, I would probably do as well. I'm not sure that was the best mechanism there, because it was definitely a part of our healing to honor that person, and it wasn't us being morbid or too attached to the situation. But they really handled it well, and that excuse me, that really helped me, because we all go through really difficult and dark places in our life, especially as first responders, and in that, seeing and feeling the complete grief and tragedy of that, and not being able to overcome it unless you work through it, it made me realize the far reaching impact. Because a person who commits suicide is trying to escape their pain most of the time and their
Hmm.
circumstances. Perhaps it's shame or guilt or embarrassment, but that's also pain, and it's a form of it. And they think, and the narrative is often, well, the world's better off without me. Um, they, I'm a burden. People don't need me. And so it's easy to think that that's a viable resolution that positively impacts the world around you and the people around you, but it doesn't. It just compounds their grief. And we know
Right.
statistically that people who lose a loved one to suicide is more likely to commit suicides,
Yeah.
significantly more so. And so for me, that was a critical and needed piece, because suicide was never an option, no matter how bad things got. I always had to keep fighting and find a way through it. So I'm really still sad about those circumstances, but I am really grateful, because, of course, in the length of career I've had, there are more suicides, and now more. It's the number one killer of cops and firefighters, and it probably is of EMS and nurses and dispatchers and corrections officers too, but we don't yet have a mechanism to track those things. And but it's horrible. So for that, I find a lot of gratitude because it helped me and my brother to buckle down and never consider that to be an option.
Yeah. It's easy to say like, hey, that's not going to be an option. Like that's not what I'm going to do because, especially with people that I've interviewed on here, they never thought that that was an option either until they were in that moment. And it was that moment that they're like, whoa, how did I get here? Right. So, how have you throughout your career, throughout your life, put in place basically mitigations to you even thinking those thoughts or mitigations to getting you to that level of low that some of these people are in? And we see things, we experience things ourselves that you're like, how am I going to get through this? Like, what were your tactics and tools for that?
Well, I'd like to pretend that they were always good tactics and tools, but they weren't. um, I had to pretty early realize an attitude. And part of that attitude was a phrase that I use all the time. Whether it's true or not, it helps me. It's everything that happens is meant to be. And I don't always know or understand the reason, especially in the moment when you're deep, deep in that mud, that difficulty, and you're trudging through. But it helps me to find meaning in the loss of a friend or in a horrible circumstance or in a catastrophic illness because I don't understand it, but there's something that is meant to be. And so that became a phrase that frankly I had to adopt in order to survive this really rough and tumble vicious career that just if you let it will rip your soul out of you. That helps me to understand when a child dies. That helps me to understand when I lose a partner, especially to murder, because understanding a death by illness is one thing, but understanding a death by violence is much harder to process most of the time. And it helps you to find fairness in things that are unfair, and perhaps gratitude. One of the things that I deal with a lot doing what I do now and for a long time as a peer support person is managing unfairness and shame and betrayal and guilt and grief. And I think that there are a couple of things that we have to understand. In fact, it's funny. And while we talk, I'm going to look at my notes I was taking earlier today because I realize that as we do this, sometimes we don't have a class that we teach specifically for this. So, a path for me to healing and some of the essential functions are one of the pieces is forgiveness. And people hate that word. And I have too. How is that even possible? And I can talk more about that, but we can't start with forgiveness because it's too much, especially when somebody has betrayed you or hurt you or done something that should never be done to another human, especially a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so forgiveness starts with tolerance. It's tolerating the fact that this has happened and that you can't change it. And that leads to acceptance. And acceptance of something that is unfair or painful or violent is really hard. But again, there's that phrase, everything that happens is meant to be. And that was my form of acceptance. And it sometimes helped me to look for meaning and find that proverbial silver lining. Because when one of my friends was murdered in the line of duty, it resulted in a bunch of very necessary officer safety training so that we wouldn't make the same mistakes he made. And I remember people saying things like, never speak ill of the dead. And I said, well, first of all, I don't completely agree with that. And second, there's no ill being spoken because if I was killed, I want people to not make the same mistakes and to learn from it. And if you speak ill of me, if that's what you call it, then do it.
Mm-hmm.
Blast me. Because if I
Right.
make mistakes or if there are technical or equipment or procedural errors that could kill somebody else, then let's put it out there. But then the third phase after that, and it's a long, difficult process, is forgiveness. And I think there are three pieces to that. There's the first, and everybody argues about what's more difficult. They all are really hard. So the first is forgiveness of others. The second is asking forgiveness of others. And the third is forgiving yourself.
Hmm.
And all of them are equally difficult.
When you were in the field, you had talked about, like that you didn't have the healthy coping skills. What were some of the unhealthy coping skills that you turned to? Because I think so much in this world, I mean, alcohol is so easily consumable. It's in our faces everywhere, and it's also a depressant. So we add that into a low emotional state, and then we're just compacting a lower mood for us. And these things you've learned now, right? You've learned, kind of post these traumatic events, and you're prepared for other traumatic things that are occurring. But what was it that you turned to early in your career where you're like, you know what, I wish to tell somebody, like, this is not good. Like, this is normalized, but I'm going to push you away from it instead of like everything that you have learned. Because I think that portion right there is people can get lost. We're like, yeah, you learned that. That's great and wonderful. But they don't realize that what they're doing is not healthy either.
Well, alcohol is one of many good examples. It works, right? I mean, it takes the edge off. It helps people to sleep a little bit. It's when you're on fire and still adrenalized from an event, like you said, it's a depressant, so it takes us down a level. It quiets the chatter in your voice. All of these different things. It slows your heart rate and breathing. Um, that's why it's that's why it's the go-to, especially for cops. And I will
And it's
say that
legal.
it's legal. Yeah, yeah. I mean, what we're seeing that I am really scared about is the legalization of all these different drugs and psychedelics and stuff. Is people are taking a journey that is really dangerous for healing and prevents healing in a lot of ways. But I was pretty lucky because that wasn't my go-to, and the reason is because my uncle I mentioned, who was a highway patrolman, and a lot of family members struggle with alcoholism, and I saw it's during that. I think it was. I could really think about it and remember, but I saw during that same difficult time period, my uncle was a highway patrolman. It's a long story, but he burned down his house, arson. Uh, he went in, broke the door down with a shotgun, kicked his then second or third wife out. And because she wasn't listening and he was really drunk, he poured gasoline on everything, set it on fire. And he went to prison. And so I know that I have a very addictive type personality. If I'm in on something, it's all in. And so I knew if I went down that path, it would ruin me quickly. It did him and other members of my family. And then I saw it around me too, the drugs and the alcohol. I mean, I remember watching drug deals all the time in school and seeing people, just that I grew up with crash and burn. And I remember looking at our grade school pictures before we went to high school, and the number of people who actually graduated was a very small percentage. So I didn't know how to deal with it. One thing I did really well was aggression. Um, Aggression is addictive too, because I learned aggression playing football because it helps you when the coach comes in and he says these horrible things. You know what they did to your mother and your sister, and none of it's true, but you allow yourself to be aggressive and angry at that person. You could turn it on, and then later you learn to turn it on at a moment's notice. One of the cures for aggression is to go out, and this is actually turns into a healthy thing if you do it properly. But you go hit the heavy bag or do a hard run or hit the gym. So that became my primary addiction. And I know that's a healthy coping mechanism most of the time, but it's also one, like anything, that can be negative because
Yeah.
later in life, when I had a family, it was something that drew me away from them because I had to get out or blow up on them. And so I'd be gone for hours, on a run or a hike or something, just trying to work through that. Um, so in the early years, I feel like I managed really well because I didn't grow up with parents using those maladaptive coping mechanisms. But what I did was I'm a master isolator. And there is a difference between solitude and isolation or loneliness. They're three different things. And we sometimes don't recognize that. We think that isolation is healthy. And later in life, what I ended up doing was pushing people I love the most away and good friends. Luckily, I had people around me who they call, they text, and I get a text. Okay, it's been 3 texts. We know what you're doing, and we're coming to your damn house to pick you up, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
um, but that's still my go-to, and that's something, frankly, I'm much better at, but not, I haven't mastered yet. Is isolation. I always say if I'm teaching or something. Luckily, I wasn't isolating with a bottle of Jack and a revolver with one round in the chamber, spinning the chamber.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing, I mean, with addiction and things, because I didn't go to alcohol, other things had to fill that void. And working out is always a healthy one. But when you're feeling like crap and you don't want to, it's easy to push that away or not burn the chemicals. Um, at one point, when I was really having a hard time, I turned to Monster Energy. And I remember my buddy, as he guzzled one down, he said, "When you get to 3 a day, you have a problem, buddy, and you better be careful." And I kind of laughed because I thought, well, this is a positive thing. But when you have to take 3 aspirin with every one that you drink because you know it's going to give you an immediate headache, something is wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I drink the sugar free, so it's so much healthier with all that sucralose and it's aspartame or aspartamine or whatever it is. Man, I was getting massive headaches from it, and it would affect my vision sometimes. And yet I'd pop three Excedrin and guzzle one down. And I bought them in vats from Costco, so there was no shortage of it. And then there are a lot of things where I almost got led completely into it. I was working with a squad where, and these are all cops, where they would come in and say, "Hey, meet us for coffee," or something. And they'd be on their phones when you got there, and they'd be shooting each other links to different porn or whatever it was. "Hey, check this out." And it was the norm, which is a super weird thing to say, isn't it? I mean, but it was, and it was
Yeah.
something that, and it's like you said, I mean, all of these things that I'm talking about are legal. But all of them can destroy you
Mm-hmm.
and your relationships, but more than anything, it impacts your soul and your
Yeah.
character. Because especially as a cop, you know that you talk about it being voluntary, but the people involved in that stuff, it's not really voluntary. It's probably happening in a um, depraved Eastern Bloc country where, this person has been forced into this most of their life, or it's a kidnapping situation, or a person who was abused that turns to that. And we know those statistics behind it and the truth behind it. And yet it's easy to justify, well, they're adults. Um, I was
Yeah.
go ahead.
I
Sorry.
it just I think it like almost irks me a little bit because it is something that, kind of like what you're talking about. Well, it's not as bad as, right? It's not as bad as something else. And that doesn't discredit the damage that it does, the pornography, problems that we have, the infidelity that we have in first responders. I mean, infidelity is the number one stress coping skill that they use. Is that illegal? No. Is that healthy? Absolutely not. Does that come back to our character and who we are? Absolutely, right? And so you talk about these things, and I think that's why it irks me a little bit, because within the culture of first responders, we also allow it.
Yeah.
And, just like
Encourage
that,
it.
right?
Yeah.
It's encouraged, it's talked about. And, it's like, oh, if you can't deal with this stuff, then you also can't deal with the career.
Yeah.
And, I think just what you're talking about is there's so much frustration behind that, because I'm like, that's not appropriate though. Like that doesn't give you a pass to saying it's okay.
Well, you should be. You use the word frustrated, and I think you said angry, and you should be, and I am too. And frankly, I was, and I think, and let's just continue to fill in the blanks. Some of these were most not. I mean, these weren't my go-to, but we could say the same thing about gambling. We could say the
Hmm.
same thing about um, uh, excessive shopping, which is a big one, and even
Yeah.
video games are a big one, right?
Right. Because it's instant gratification.
Yeah,
That's what's happening.
yeah.
It's instant gratification. It's an instant, dopamine rush that you get. You get this adrenaline where you have been doing that all throughout the day, but now you need it's your tolerance. It's
Yeah.
just like with medications that we take, right? Your tolerance is here. Oh, we've hit that. Now we need to take more. Now we need more. And so now you're just, kind of going up and up with that. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, a lot of people have different ways of coping that you could say are normal, but it's to what extent? And how is that disturbing your life, right? How is
Yeah.
that disturbing your daily practice of being a human? How is that interrupting you?
Yeah. Well, and if you have to do something in secret, I mean, there are legitimate reasons to do things in secret. If you're buying a Christmas gift for somebody and wrapping it, that's a fun and I
Right,
think we could argue probably healthy thing to do, right?
right.
Um, and if you're preparing a surprise or something like that, but if you have to do something in secret, or if you would be embarrassed if your mom found out, or fill in the blank, your captain or your boss at work or something like that, or if it's something that could jeopardize your reputation, I mean, you know, and that's the thing. You said it in different words, but we justify things before we even get started to make it okay. And sometimes we reach to them in a time where we're really hurting, and we just kind of don't realize what we're getting into because we need to soothe that fire and subdue it a little bit. But all of those things, I mean, like you said, it hits those dopamine and adrenaline centers in our brain. It releases testosterone, and all those are healing chemicals that help us to feel better. I mean, they allow people to go into battle and do amazing things, or battle is a relative term. Maybe rush into a fire if you're a firefighter, or lift up that car literally to save
Hmm.
a person underneath. And so those chemicals feel really good, and we should be seeking those on a certain level. But you can get that, we know, from a good relationship. We know that you can get that from a good workout. And we know that or even cold water immersion is an important one. And we know
Hmm.
that those things are really healthy. But um, we look for the quick fix, like you said. And nothing that really works and sticks with us is quick. It's always long, arduous, and difficult. I think
Absolutely.
I should say, too, that one thing I learned is that, and here's where I really had to reckon with it. I feel like, whatever happens behind the scenes, I said, whatever happens, it's meant to be. And God's big hand comes in and moves his chess pieces, and he knows, but we don't know. And that's because we're all trying to control our circumstances. That's how you survive in these difficult jobs. But I feel like there are two things too to add to that list that I mentioned earlier with forgiveness and acceptance. I feel like gratitude is underrated,
Hmm.
and it's so important. And then faith. And one thing that is really difficult is all of us are guilty of putting our faith in a person, or a business, or a boss, or a mechanism that's going to just
Hmm.
chew us up and spit us out. It's like putting faith in your lawnmower when you reach into it to unclog the grass that it won't cut your hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, my faith was what was tested, and that's what really saved me, really brought me out of it, was having that. And it was always there, but man, uh, going through things really makes you um, just find what fight you're fighting and how you're going to fight it. And I learned that's how I fight it, is finding faith in things. And it all comes circles back to that phrase I made up: everything that happens is meant to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for gratitude for listeners, if you want to go back to episode 95, I actually go through my three G's that I call it. So grit, grace, and gratitude. And just that simple skill, actually, I had a first responder suicide save. He found himself in a situation, and, was sitting there, and he just for hours kept going through that list, kept going through that list, because the gratitude piece also allows us to be in the present moment. And so many people are trying to find that, and they don't understand what that actually means because they've never truly paid attention to how they feel in that moment, where they're like, I don't want to think about, what's in my thoughts or what's going on, because it's scary. And that's why they numb it. And that's why they try to not have these thoughts and not want to think and pry into the questions that we want to ask ourselves. And so I full-heartedly believe in gratitude. And that episode talks about how that actually is the number one thing that got me out of my breakup, where it's like, okay, it sucks and I don't have control over what his actions were, but I do have control over what I'm thankful for. And there's so many times where we want to go to, how can we make things better, or how can we level things up, or how can we fix things, and it's like, can we also just be thankful for what we have? Like, let's stop for a second and actually evaluate that. And people are not, they need guided in that. They need it, they need the time, they need the space, they need the prompting. And I love it because I love, that's what I do with people, and that's what I do with one-on-one coaching. But it just saddens me that, like, the rest of the world doesn't understand like how simple these things are. It's hard work. I'm not going to lie on that, but they're right in front of us as well.
Well, man, everything you said, and I love your three G's, which is kind of a reiteration of what I'm saying. And it's not new. I mean, it's not like we're reinventing, or we are
Right.
reinventing and relabeling it, but it's not like we've found something, discovered something new. I love it. But you talked about how gratitude allows you to live in the moment. Sometimes it could take you from the moment too. When things are really difficult, if you are really struggling, you could say, what do I have to be grateful for right now? And it may just be, wow, I woke up this morning, the sun came up again. Or it may be, I have a car that's that I can drive and I can get away from this for a little while or something. But finding a moment of gratitude is amazing. But a higher level, and plussing up and leveling up on that is, how do I find gratitude in the suffering and appreciate the
Hmm.
suffering? And so, saying, like you mentioned, how do I sit through this and experience it and not postpone that grief
Hmm.
or difficulty or circumstance and deal with it later, which is what we're good at. Go the next call, go the next call, push it down. How do I sit in it? Excuse me. So, being able to be thankful for suffering and saying, I don't know how, but this is going to make me better, is really important.
Yeah. What would you say to your younger self getting into this career, the individuals that are getting into the career nowadays? I mean, you talked about it, how many murders we've had, for on police officers. We still have this ambush on first responders. There's not a lot of people, I feel like, talking about that, where it's always happened, but it's at a heightened even more. Like, what would you tell your younger self, or people that are getting into it in today's day?
Uh, so, excuse me, that's a hard question. And I ask it all the time. And everybody pauses to think about it. So I asked myself that question a while ago. And I struggle with it because I would like to go back and say, hey, you're going to make it through. There's a really difficult time coming, but it wouldn't be the same negative impact in the beginning that I needed to propel me further. And I mentioned finding gratitude in grief and suffering. When you are able to do that, that truly is what levels you up and promotes you in life to make you ready for the next experience, because it's going to be harder. It's never easier than the first one, but sometimes it feels easier because of what you're going through. So that's what I teach the young people is find your words, grit, grace, and gratitude in that suffering. I think there's another thing too. Learning to suffer intentionally is an important part of life. And there's so many ways we could do that. Um, I talked about cold water therapy. That's one I hate. I hate
I
cold
love it.
water. Everybody jokes about all this Viking blood that I have coursing through my veins. And I just don't like cold weather, even though my ancestors lived there. But if you do jujitsu, getting choked out by a nasty, sweaty guy who stinks. There's running or fitness. And grief is like going to a drill sergeant or instructor in boot camp, or going to the TAC officer in your academy, or going to a personal trainer and saying, hey, I want to be better and I want you to kick my ass.
Hmm.
Because it's hard. and there's no way around it. And there's, it's hard when you can't catch your breath, take that figuratively or literally. It's hard to focus and push through that. But when you learn to do it in real life, in a situation where you say, okay, I've been here, it's not that bad, I can work through it, and I know I have to slow down, I have to slow my breathing, I have to catch my breath and push through, it makes you better. And so that's one thing also that I teach people is, and I mentioned a few, there's also fasting and learning to not eat. And it just makes you so much more
Hmm.
appreciative of the little things. Like when you do eat after a period of fasting, it's so much better, you know? So that's what I guess the one thing I would tell myself is learn to suffer well. But I think I learned that pretty early because of all the things that happened. And sports were a huge part of it for me, athletics.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What about just on the policing side? I mean, what would you tell these young folks getting into it right now on the policing side?
To see, I talk to the young people a lot. One of the things I'm so blessed to be able to do is to go to the recruits that are about to enter the academy. So the academy here, Basic Law Enforcement Academy, BLEA, we call it BLEA. So pre-BLEA, I get to go talk to the people from the agency I left, King County Sheriff's Department, and talk to them. And then now I get to talk to advanced groups in their mandatory training and other groups as well. And it's kind of cool. We're working out a piece because I did so much time doing the cool guy stuff with defensive tactics and combatives. But the piece I never taught in officer survival was this, what we're talking about. And so we're working on a thing to go back into that environment and talk about that. So another piece that I would add to that is you cannot do it alone. And that's what we all do. We all push and isolate. And if I wanted to totally disrupt society, I would start with the kids, easy target, very susceptible to it. And there's so many mechanisms. They just need an iPad or something like that. And I could get to their heart and soul pretty easily. And then after that, I'd go to first responders. Because if the police collapse, the fire department can't function. If they cease to exist, the violence increases in society. Huh. Kind of sounds
Hmm.
like our world. It kind of sounds like Seattle, where I live, completely falling apart.
Yep.
So it breaks my heart to go in there, but I talk about not only all these things we talked about, but the one thing I never did, and my dad taught me not to do because he said, "No, you never talk to four people. You never talk to attorneys, never talk to politicians, never talk to the media, or a damn shrink." And he was right about all of them, even the shrink part. Um, because so many do harm instead of good with first responders because they don't understand our brain, how we work, how we function, and we don't manifest symptoms of post traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation the same way other people do because we're so good at pushing through. We're so resilient. That's what one of the qualities to hire us. And we're so good at pushing it down and dealing with it later that everything erupts when it comes out. So I teach them,
Hmm.
and it's kind of cool because King County Sheriff's Department, where I worked, is talking about a program where new recruits will have mandatory counseling appointments 8 times a year for the first 2 years of their career to normalize it and set the tone. Because still to this day, even though I'm surrounded by people who are doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, and I joke about it all the time, I never talk to a damn shrink. What am I doing in a car full of them or teaching in a classroom full of them? But still, that's a thing where I have a certain level of guilt going there because my dad always taught me not to do it. That makes
That's
sense.
something you gotta let go of.
Yeah.
You gotta
I
let go of going to the shrink. I do think there's a place and a time for them. I definitely understand, and this is what got me into the coaching one on one and going into departments and speaking to them as well, is because there's that experience factor. And it is very difficult to explain. I mean, I go through therapy. I have therapy tonight, actually, but it's not actually talking about the job. And I will say, so many first responders, that's an excuse. I'm going to just call it as it is, right? Yes, it is different than most people, but just telling people, oh, well, I'm a first responder, you don't understand what I do. Are you actually telling them what you do also? No, you're pushing that away. You're pushing away your feelings. You're pushing away the emotions. You're pushing, and isolating. And so there's this point where how could they understand? How literally could your spouse understand what you're going through because you haven't said a word, right? And that is a lot of times, even, on these counselors and psychologists, is, you know, you have this pre-discussion with them and you don't say anything, and then you get into the room with them, and then now you have the champagne effect, like I like to talk about, right? Like the cork comes off, your emotions just start exploding, and what you're describing are these very intense calls that you're going on to that are human beings, and the person's like, holy shit, I don't know what to do, right? And that's where the harm comes in. That's where, like, we now have to talk to them. We're like, oh shit, like, I didn't mean to explode on you, but like, this is what's going on, right? And so I'm going to say there's a place for a counselor and, therapy in the world of, getting that connected with somebody that is vetted and understands first responders. But I think first responders also need to understand that you're dealing with just not the job. Like, you're dealing with more than the job, and you can go to a regular counselor for that. Marriage, financial, there's so many other things that happen to human beings besides the job, that I talk with people that have never been first responders and they're needing to go and get help for stuff. And, the things that we talk about, I think, and sorry for going on kind of a tangent on this, but it's like, first responders, you also need to be taking accountability of talking through what's happening. And that's obviously why I teach on being raw. But there's also a point where quit putting that as an excuse that people don't understand what you do, because you have peers, you have people in your department that absolutely know what the fuck you do, right? Go to and talk with them. Go, it's fun because that's actually what I'm going to be talking about in Coeur d'Alene. We talked about that before we started, but peer support is more than just a peer support group. Like, I've had more peer support. My department didn't even have a peer support team. We all were our peers. Like, we all were debriefing with each other. We all were working through these situations. We all were getting mentored, and we all were mentoring others. And I think there's just so much labels of like, oh, well, like I said, I just keep coming back to it. Like, you don't know what I go through. And it's like, well, how the fuck would I know what you go through? You don't even fucking talk about it. Like,
Yeah.
that just is what happens.
Yeah. I hope I
Sorry
didn't
about that little
interrupt.
tangent.
No, I love it. No, there's so much. So you said a lot of things, and I was thinking about all the avenues we could go, but here's what stands in our way. And this is prolific, and it is the thing that has sent many a good man and woman to their ruin, and it's pride. And when we don't seek help, that's pride. When we don't admit that we had a hard time with something, that's pride. And when we label people like those damn shrinks, that's pride. It's, they can't understand me. I'm complex. I'm unique. I'm difficult. Guess what? You're not that difficult. When I do post traumatic stress retreats to help police officers and firefighters, the thing that happens there is it's the first time they told their story because they sucked it up and kept it in, because we're all tough guys, right? Badasses. And so the first time they start telling their story, they realize, oh, wow, that gal has the same story I do. And so does that guy. How is that possible? And when I teach classes to build peer support and we do a critical incident stress debriefing, in fact, I was just out in your area not too long ago in Eagle and a few other places. I wish I knew you. I would have bought you lunch. But when I went out there, we had all these people from different agencies come together and we did a debriefing. And it always works. We always think it's not going to, but I said, they're all from different departments. And we said, you draw from one of your calls and we're going to debrief that. And there's overlap because all of us have been on that call. Now, I was I watched a few of your things and I saw that your first call was a helicopter crash. So none of us have had that,
Mm-hmm.
but we've all had the person where they're slipping away and we're trying to save them. And there are these overlapping circumstances, and there's always a communication issue. The radios don't work. There's always the stress. And then we all have betrayal. And so, um, and what great leadership it would be. I have a friend who in the military went through a lot of stuff, and he just oozes respect. People see him with the tattoos and the operator beard, and every day he'd line up his guys and say, all right, guys, here's the schedule. Here's what we're going to do. He'd say, at 1400, I will be away for 1 hour talking to my therapist. What great leadership, to set that tone and
Mm-hmm.
make it normal. And on the occasions, not because I was smart enough to recognize this, but because other people modeled it for me, where I would say, man, that was a really hard call. How are you guys doing? Everything spilled out and everybody started talking about it. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you're right. But one other thing I want to say too is you're a coach, and I'll call you a peer too. And that's counseling as well. And like you said, meeting
Mm-hmm.
with a group, not going to choir practice and throwing back a bunch of drinks. And like you said, hooking up with the bartender, that's not counseling or therapy. It feels good in the moment, but just being around like-minded people and actually dropping the pride and talking and maybe shedding a few tears or a lot of tears is what we
Mm-hmm.
don't do and what we need to do. And frankly, I mean, I didn't say it earlier, but I'll say it loudly now. That has been and still is the biggest thing that I struggle with. A lot of things that I went through, some of those betrayals stripped me of that. And now I'm grateful. It was really hard to be stripped of that. And it's still hard sometimes to think about what I could have been or to want to be that mask, badass, the mask that I wore. But the truth is, I'm so much better as a person when I'm kind and I'm not trying to be a tough guy. When I'm listening to people, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
listening to you was awesome because you brought up so many things. I feel like we could talk for hours.
Yeah. I feel like I could talk with most people for hours because it's just it's very intriguing. It's getting different viewpoints. It's seeing what are people's experiences and especially the hope for this podcast is to share these stories and like you talked about, the storylines are so similar amongst so many different people and just being able to hear that people can have that hope and say, "Oh, I'm not alone. I'm not
Which,
this
yeah, I
isn't,
mean, we.
only happening to me. There's other people." Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. There was a little bit of you turned into a robot for a minute on my end, and you were
Oh,
moving like a strobe light, and I heard the robot voice, the gremlins. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It was speaking when I thought there was a pause. But yeah, if we can, so much of what we do, especially early in life when we're young, trying to impress people, is a facade. We're trying to be something we're not, and you know, those stories to me mean so much more when they come from that place with the true. I mean, it's fun to tell a good war story about driving fast and jumping out of the car and running and all that stuff. And I'll still do that. But the human piece, the overcoming difficulty piece, the gratitude piece are so much more. And that's what connects us truly. And that's where
yeah.
another thing we need is finding our tribe, our like minded people. That's what we're meant to do.
Hmm. Yeah. I remember I was actually on a date for this and um he was in the military and we were talking about, um tribes and like he was like I just miss, the camaraderie and I'm like you get to now build that. You now get to build your own tribe. Like you're the leader of it. You get to decide who's on your crew and who's on your squad and what positions they're in, and if they're not in there to want to win the fight with you, then like they're not in your tribe with you. And I think so many people think that like, I can talk to a lot of people. My close group of people though that like I could call up and be like, we got to go get some shit done, right? Like it's really small because that's how it's supposed to be. It's the more intimate, connections that you have with people and the protection that comes with that. And I think people just need the permission. Like you're an adult. You get to decide who's in your tribe and who's not in your tribe. And the people that are in my tribe are assets to me. Like they're not liabilities. I have taken liabilities out of my life, and that's something that just this past year that I've really literally had to write down on piece of paper is like who is an asset, who is a liability. If you don't know who's in your tribe, do that exact thing. Write down who are you around the most. And it may be your friends, it may be your coworkers, it may be your family members. Sit down and write out who the people are that are in your life continuously. Are they an asset? Are they a liability? You'll figure out who's in your tribe.
Help or hurt. Yeah, I was
Yep.
looking for something. Um, I recently redefined tribe in my own words, and I was hoping I could find it while we're talking. But you're right, because when we sign up for, especially first responder jobs and the military, they take a group of people that are completely different backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities and religious experience and all of that stuff, and they thrust them together and make them work. And that's a good mechanism. And you develop true friendship, but you also develop what you think is true friendship that will betray you later. And some of those people are people you would not choose to live or work with otherwise because of their maybe lack of character or because of their attitude about things, or some of those things we mentioned, like their infidelity, their lying or
It's
deceit.
core values. They have no
Yeah,
core values.
yeah,
Or their core values are completely different than yours,
yeah,
and you don't want to be associated with them.
yeah. And but that can work too. I mean, you can have different things, but you have to find the common thread. And that I am, man, I am so fortunate and grateful for who my tribe really is. And when I see my people, like when we get together for one of those retreats to help other people, everybody there is a servant minded person. They're truly the heroes of my book. And these hugs that we give are so meaningful and impactful. And, we look forward to those opportunities. So, but I think that you talked about choosing, and I think that we have to go through those bad things to learn that. We have to really be burned by a person that's a part of our tribe. We call them brother and sister, and we really have to be burned and let down, and more than once, in order to understand that piece. And
Hmm.
I'm so grateful for that. And while we're talking, I found it. Do you want to hear my definition of tribe?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So the actual definition is a social group composed chiefly of numerous families, clans, or generations having shared ancestry. My definition: a primal bond between people in a group or clan, shared language, pain, happiness, experience, setback, and growth, growing together and supporting one another for a common goal. A group that supports one another regardless of circumstance without judgment. A group that fiercely, with tribal ferocity, protects and defends one another. A gathering of people that are not bonded by familial connections, but that consider one another to be brothers and sisters worth fighting for and sometimes even dying for.
That that encompasses first responders all in one passage. Very cool.
Yes.
Very cool. Well, Patrick, I wish I could spend all day talking with you, but unfortunately I can't. So any last parting words that you have for us?
Yes. What I do now, I work for First Responder Wellness, and I have the opportunity to help my true brothers and sisters that I care about so much all the time, every day. And so I'm available everywhere. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook, and kind of available on Instagram. But and through Mackenzie, you could get a hold of me or whatever. But if you are hurting, or if you're suffering through a relationship with a first responder, if you are trying to find your way, or if you've lost your way entirely and you're feeling lost, maybe suicidal, I would love to help any way I can. And it may not be me. Maybe you don't like what I said or me. I don't care. I'll link you up with somebody. I'll find somebody that can help. Um, it is truly an honor for me to lean in with you and help. And I think I probably understand a lot of what you're going through because maybe I went through something similar. or at least a friend I have has. So I think that's the main thing. But the second thing, I love what you're doing. And so I look forward to future opportunities to talk. And I'm grateful for this. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. I do really appreciate it. And guest, if you are listening and you want to be a podcast guest, just like Patrick did, please reach out to me. The email is in the show notes. I would absolutely love for you to be able to come on and share your story with driving, with first responders, community involvement, and really being able to show people how they can get from the struggle to the strength of their story. And you have to be able to have pillars and other people in your life, and we are examples of that. So I would absolutely love for you guys to reach out to us. With that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye, guys.